In the previous video, we already took a look at the balance of payments account for the US for 2015, I believe, right? For just 1 year. So here, let's continue our discussion about the BOP, and let's take a look at the evolution of the three accounts, again, for the United States. So here, this figure shows you from 1990 all the way to 2019, the year right before the pandemic, okay? And you would be able to find that current account, okay, which is red bars here below zero line, because, you know, we always run a current account deficit, right? And the orange bar here above the zero line, that's a financial account. And the capital account is quite small, okay, for most of the years. So it's oftentimes invisible, okay. And then you see the yellow ones, these are statistical discrepancy, okay. Now, obviously, the observation we can make here is you find that, you know, this chart is symmetric, right? If we draw a line here, you know, the zero line, here you would find that the two sides are symmetric, okay? Now, I would strongly encourage you guys to pause the video at this moment and think about this, why it's symmetric. Is this just a coincidence? Or there might be some theoretical reason behind this, the symmetry, okay? We're going to talk about that on the next slide, okay? And I would also encourage you to look at the trend, okay, among these three accounts, okay? And I think you can bring your thoughts to our class. We can discuss that, okay? Like, you know, these either deficits or surplus, are they becoming larger or smaller over time? Is there any kind of single year or event that affected the trend? Okay. You can also think about, you know, how, like, you know, what does this huge current account deficit for the US mean? Is that good or bad? In what sense it's good? In what sense it's bad? Okay. Now, of course, we heard a lot of people out there worried about the current account deficit, the huge deficit the US has over these years, right? But when you know, look at this, staring at this chart, you would find that at the same time, the US is running a huge financial account surplus, right? So if, as the general public believes, the current account deficit is bad for the US, does that mean the financial account surplus is good, right? Because it looks like it's the opposite side. So once again, bring your thoughts to our class and we can discuss, okay? All right, now let's take a look at that, the symmetric thing we mentioned a minute ago. So here, let's take a look at, you know, what we have already learned from the BOP account, okay? And so it looks like, you know, on that figure, the current account deficit must be offset by the financial account surplus, okay? Now remember here, the word we use is must be. In other words, it's not going to be a coincidence. Okay, so there got to be some theoretical reason behind that symmetric relationship. Okay, let's take a look at this very quickly. So a country with a current account deficit, it's going to be a net borrower. Why it's a net borrower? Because remember, current account deficit means what you exported to the rest of the world is less than what you imported from them, right? In other words, your production is less than your spending, right? So you have to borrow, just like, at the individual level, right? If what you make is less than what you spend, you have to borrow, right? You can borrow from your credit card company, from the bank, or mortgage lender, right? And so here, that's why at the country level, we also believe that the current account deficit means the country must be a net borrower, okay? Net borrower means, how much you borrow from the rest of the world is going to be more than how much you lend to the rest of the world. Okay. Now, any borrower on lead sells assets. In other words, issuing the IOUs to the lenders. Again, at the individual level, this is pretty easy to understand, right? So if you borrow from banks, you get, write a contract, right? Said, I owe you this much money, right? It's the same thing for the countries, okay? So they have to sell the assets. At the country level, the assets could be, there could be a variety of assets. And the most commonly mentioned one is treasury bonds, okay, or treasury bills. So you find that, we can sell these to the foreign lenders, okay? By the BOP identity, it has a surplus in its asset accounts. Okay? In other words, when we sell these financial assets, monetary assets, then we would start running a surplus in these asset accounts, right? So putting together, that's why, for example, United States has a huge current account deficit and financial account surplus at the same time, right? And that's why here we said that, the current account deficit must be offset by financial account surplus, okay? So every dollar of the current account deficit, we must borrow from the foreign entities, right? Including their governments, households, or businesses. Now, when we borrow $1, we have to sell $1 asset to them. So in the financial account, we will see a $1 surplus. All right. So in theory, these two got to be equal, on the opposite sides. So they offset with each other perfectly. Okay. Now, vice versa, we would say the current account surplus must be offset by the financial account deficit. Okay. And the logical reasoning is quite similar. So a country with a current account surplus is a net lender, right? Because what they produce for the rest of the world is more than what they buy from the rest of the world. Okay, so they get extra money, they lend to the rest of the world. And a lender on lend buys assets. In other words, they will acquire the IOUs from the borrowers. Okay, so when they lend, for example, they would buy the US treasury bonds or treasury assets or any other monetary assets issued by American entities. So by the BOP identity, it has a deficit in its asset accounts, in other words, financial accounts. An example would be China, which has a huge current account surplus and a financial account deficit at the same time. Okay. So through this logical reasoning, it should be easy for you to understand why, a country always has a huge a deficit in one account and a surplus in another account. Okay. Putting together, the BOP actually makes the connection between a country's income and the spending decisions in the evolution of that country's wealth. Okay. Again, as we said, the current account, for example, shows you, if the country makes money or not through the international trade, and then the financial account will tell us, their spending decisions. Okay, or vice versa, if the country, is running a current account deficit, that's probably their spending decisions, right? They spend more, and then on the income side, then they have to sell their financial assets, right? All right, now, speaking of the country's wealth, we want to introduce another simple concept here. It's called the net foreign wealth, or net international investment position. Okay, so these two are interchangeable. Now, the net international investment position can be calculated by adding up all the rest of the world assets owned by the home country, and then subtracting all the home assets owned by the rest of the world. Okay. Putting it differently, we're talking about all the foreign assets owned by the U.S. minus all the domestic assets in the U.S., but they actually owned by the foreign entities. Okay. And so here I'm putting out this Fred chart about the U.S. net international investment positions from, I believe, 2014 all the way to 2021. Okay, as you can see that it gets worse and worse. We could say that, right, or further and further below zero line, right? And of course, this is because of the, as we just mentioned, over time we have larger and larger current account deficit. Okay, so we have to borrow more and more. All right, that's why this number gets larger as negative. Okay, and also I want to drive your attention to the recent years, especially after 2018. You find that it looks like this downward trend becomes even steeper, right? In other words, there's a kind of acceleration of the debt we own, okay, to the foreign entities. Now you can think about why, what kind of the explanations you can come up with, and bring your thoughts to class, and we can discuss that. At the end of the 2021, the U.S. had a net foreign wealth of about minus $18,101 billion. Okay? In other words, slightly above $18 trillion. Okay? And in that year, the U.S. GDP was approximately $24 trillion. So we're saying that this net foreign wealth accounts for about 75% of our GDP. But once again, remember, there's a minus sign here in front of it. That means we owe the rest of the world $18 trillion. Okay? And that means, next year, for example, if we produced just like normal, and then we don't eat, we don't drive, we don't dress, and then we would be able to use like 75% of our output to pay back the debt, our foreign debt. Okay, so that's a huge number. That made the United States the world's largest debtor in history. Okay, and of course, as you could imagine, a lot of people would worry about this. Okay, and in the later chapters, we're gonna delve into some details. Okay, and talk more about why or how we get here, and is there any possible ways we can fix this? Okay. All right, so at this point, we already wrap up our discussion about this chapter, okay? And this is a short chapter. It's an introductory chapter, okay? And as we said, we are gonna, from now on, we're gonna talk about international finance, okay? Or sometimes it's called open economy, macroeconomics, okay? And these two are interchangeable, actually. So that means, we are talking about the relationships among a variety of macroeconomic indicators, okay, in an open economy setting. So these macroeconomic indicators like, GDP, personal saving, public saving, right? And open setting means, we always talk about the transaction of goods and services and assets, okay? And we talk about the national income account, okay, global imbalances, twin deficit hypothesis, and Ricardian equivalence, okay? And the second part of the chapter is about the BoP accounts. We have three types of accounts, and we talk about their relations in the net international investment position.